The heat in Cedar Flats was a physical presence, a weight on the shoulders and a shimmer in the air that warped the hard lines of the clapboard buildings into something uncertain. It was a heat that baked the cracked earth until it gave up the ghost of the last rain, a heat that frayed tempers and shortened fuses. For Rajira Castellanos, living under the borrowed skin of Sarah Mitchell, the heat was a constant, suffocating reminder of the life she was trying to bake out of her own memory. She moved through the town like a phantom, a woman of quiet gestures and downcast eyes, her contributions limited to mending clothes and keeping to herself. She lived on the fringe, a place she had chosen because the center of anything was a place where people got noticed, and being noticed was a death sentence. The town's fear was as thick as the dust. It wasn't a sharp, immediate terror, but a low, simmering paranoia that poisoned every well of common decency. The word Apache was never spoken. It was hissed. It was a curse spat into the dirt, a shadow that fell over the supper table when the coyotes yelped too close to town. Raids, they whispered in Murphy's general store, where Sarah went for thread and flour. Vicious, godless savages. Townsend, the de facto leader of Cedar Flats, a man whose grief over a lost son had calcified into righteous, unyielding hatred, fanned these flames until they licked at the edges of reason. His voice, a booming baritone that carried from the saloon porch to the church steps, was the town's heartbeat, and its rhythm was war. Sarah, Rira, heard it all. She saw the way men started carrying their rifles, not just for hunting, but for walking to the outhouse. She saw the way women pulled their children closer if a shadow moved too quickly at dusk. She was an observer, a ghost cataloging the slow decay of a community's soul. Her own past was a maelstrom of violence and betrayal, a disastrous operation that had ended with her name smeared across wanted posters and her face etched into the mind of every lawman west of the Mississippi. She was framed, left for dead by one of her own, but the truth was a currency with no value here. Here, survival was a quiet, solitary affair. Her shack was a mile out, just far enough to be forgotten. It was there, in the shimmering late-afternoon haze, that her quiet life shattered. She was gathering sage, her hands moving with an absent-minded grace, when she saw the buzzards circling low. It was a common enough sight. A dead coyote or a steer succumbed to the heat. But something, a flicker of instinct she had long tried to suppress, pulled her closer. She moved through the scrub and thorny acacia, her worn leather boots making no sound on the parched ground. And then she saw him. He was Apache. That much was clear from the single eagle feather tied in his long black hair and the geometric patterns painted on his deerskin leggings. He was propped against a rock, his body a taut line of agony, a dark, viscous stain spreading from a gunshot wound in his side. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of sweat and dust and pain. For a moment, Rira was frozen. Every warning bell in her mind, every lesson learned in the 5 years of her self-imposed exile, screamed at her to turn back. This was not her fight. This was the enemy. To help him was to invite the town's wrath, to paint a target on her own back. Townsend's words echoed in her head. They give no quarter, and they deserve none. He was dying. She could see the shallow, ragged breaths, the tremor in his limbs. She looked at his hands, clenched in the dirt, and she saw not the hand of a savage raider, but the hand of a man. Her training, the deep, immutable core of her that was a federal marshal, took over. It wasn't a decision, not a conscious thought. It was an impulse, a reflex. Compassion, the most dangerous and instinctive part of her, surged past the walls she had so carefully built. She knelt beside him, her movements swift and efficient. "Don't try to move," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. His eyes snapped open, black and sharp with suspicion, but he was too weak to resist. She tore a strip from her petticoat, her hands already working, assessing the wound. It was bad, a clean shot but deep, and festering in the brutal heat. She needed water, clean cloth, the poultice Doc Peterson used for infections. She needed to get him out of the sun. The thought was madness. Bringing him back to her shack was suicide. Leaving him was murder. Her hands, probing the edges of the wound, became slick and stained with his blood. The dark, coppery smell filled her nostrils. She looked at her own hands, at the crimson coating her fingers, and a profound sense of dread washed over her. This was it. This was the act that would undo everything. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She half dragged, half carried him, her own body straining, the mile back to her shack feeling like 100. She laid him on her cot, the only piece of real furniture she owned, and worked with a frantic, focused energy. She cleaned the wound with whiskey she'd been saving, the sharp sting causing him to flinch, a low grunt escaping his lips. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, intelligent, trying to read the language of her actions when he could not understand her words. She packed the wound with a mash of boiled sage and yarrow, her movements sure and practiced. For 2 days she tended to him. She gave him water, spooning it past his cracked lips. She sat through his fevered shudders, the night air filled with his soft groans and the whispered words of his own tongue. She learned his name, or what she thought was his name, in a moment of lucid agony, Swift Eagle. He wasn't a raider. She knew it with a certainty that defied logic. The wound was from a rifle, a settler's gun, and it was a few days old. He'd been fleeing, not attacking. He was gathering intelligence. He tried to tell her with gestures, with drawings in the dirt floor of her shack. He pointed east, toward the mountains, and made the shape of rifles. Many rifles. He was warning her, warning them. The knock on her door came on the 3rd day. It wasn't a polite tap. It was the hard, authoritative rap of a rifle butt. Rira's blood ran cold. Through the single grimy window she saw them. Townsend was in the lead, his face a thundercloud of grim satisfaction. Behind him stood a dozen men from Cedar Flats, their expressions a mixture of fear and self-righteous anger. Murphy, the store owner, was there, his gaze fixed on the ground, his kindness a casualty of mob fear. Even Doc Peterson was with them, his face etched with a pained conflict that offered no comfort. Someone had seen her. Someone had followed the drag marks in the dust. Her secret was out. She opened the door slowly. "Townsend," she said, her voice betraying none of the terror that was clawing at her throat. His eyes swept past her, locking onto the figure on the cot. A collective gasp went through the posse. "So it's true," Townsend breathed, his voice dangerously low. "The quiet widow, harboring a murdering savage." "He was wounded," Rira said, her own voice sounding thin and strange. "He would have died. He should have died," a man shouted from the back. The sentiment rippled through the group. "He's the one," Townsend declared, stepping into the small room, his presence sucking all the air out of it. "The one they say leads the raids, the butcher of the Henley farm." Rira looked at Swift Eagle. He was struggling to sit up, his hand pressed to his bandaged side, his eyes burning with a proud defiance that would surely get him killed. He understood the tone, if not the words. He was being condemned. "You're wrong," Rira said, stepping between Townsend and the cot. It was a foolish, protective gesture. "Look at him! He's been wounded for days. He wasn't at the Henley farm yesterday." "Are you an expert now, Sarah?" Townsend sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Are you a tracker? Or just an Apache lover?" The insult hung in the stifling air. She could feel the town's judgment hardening like setting concrete. Doc Peterson finally looked at her, his expression pleading. "Don't do this. Don't fight them." Murphy just shuffled his feet, a portrait of spineless regret. She looked from face to face at these people she had lived alongside, these men and women who had offered her nods in the street, who had seemed like decent, hard-working folk. And she saw in their eyes the terrifying void of mob justice, a righteousness fueled by fear and prejudice. There was no room for evidence here, no space for compassion. There was only the baying of the pack. "Get out of the way, Sarah," Townsend commanded, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. She didn't move. She thought of her hands, stained with Swift Eagle's blood. In their eyes, that blood wasn't a symbol of a life saved. It was the mark of a traitor. Her quiet life was over. Her careful disguise had been burned away not by a lawman's long memory, but by a single, irrevocable act of mercy. "Take him!" Townsend ordered 2 of his men. They shoved her aside, her shoulder slamming into the rough-hewn wall. They grabbed Swift Eagle, who fought back with a surge of desperate strength before crying out in pain as his wound tore open. They dragged him out into the unforgiving sun. Rira followed, stumbling out of the shack. They had him on the ground, tying his hands. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling with a rage that was finally, fatally breaking free. Townsend turned to face her, his expression cold and hard as granite. He looked at the men, then back at her, his judgment falling like a hangman's noose. "He'll face justice in the square. As for you," he said, his voice dropping, "for what you've done, for consorting with the enemy, you're an outcast. You're not welcome in Cedar Flats. Get your things and walk. Don't come back." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the arid, sun-blasted landscape that stretched to the horizon. "The desert will pass its own sentence." She stood there, frozen, as they hauled Swift Eagle away, a prisoner destined for a rope. She looked at the faces of the townspeople. Doc Peterson turned away, unable to meet her gaze, his complicity a fresh wound. Murphy just stared at his boots. They were leaving her, not just casting her out, but sentencing her to death by sun and thirst. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't the hot rage of an enemy, but the cold, quiet turning of a neighbor's back. As they disappeared over the rise, a small cloud of dust, their only epitaph, Rira stood alone under the vast, indifferent sky. The heat pressed in, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any shout. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the quiet widow. She was just a woman, exiled and alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a past that was about to come rushing back with the force of a flash flood. Her lonely walk into the unforgiving desert had begun. The sun was a hammer, and the desert was its anvil. Every step Rira took away from Cedar Flats was a conscious act of will against a landscape designed to kill. The heat baked the moisture from her skin, cracked her lips, and played tricks on her eyes, turning distant mesas into shimmering castles and clumps of sagebrush into crouching figures. This was the sentence Townsend had passed, a slow execution by exposure. For the first day, she was just Sarah, the exiled woman, fueled by a bitter, simmering rage and a gnawing fear. She thought of Swift Eagle, of the pride in his eyes, even as they dragged him away. She thought of Doc Peterson's averted gaze and Murphy's silent shame. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, deeper than any bullet. But as the second sun rose, scorching the pale dawn sky, Sarah began to recede. The desert didn't care for her grief or her anger. It demanded respect. It demanded skill. And deep within the quiet widow, the federal marshal began to stir. Rira Castellanos knew this terrain. She knew how to read the faint trails of nocturnal animals to find pockets of shade, how to scan the rock formations for the darker green that signaled a seep of precious water. She walked not with the desperate shuffle of a victim, but with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone who understood the economy of movement. Her mind, once clouded with the fog of her hidden life, began to clear. The instincts she had suppressed for 5 years sharpened. She noticed the way a lizard skittered for cover, indicating the path of a snake. She found a trickle of alkaline water weeping from a rock face, and she knew to dig below it, to let the sand filter the worst of the bitterness. She was no longer just surviving. She was operating. With this clarity came a new kind of terror. Late in the afternoon, as she crested a low ridge, she saw a flicker of reflected light miles behind her. It wasn't the random glint of mica in rock. It was deliberate, a spyglass. She dropped to her belly behind a cluster of creosote bushes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the hot, stony ground. She waited, her breathing slow and controlled, and saw it again. A lone rider, perched on a bluff overlooking the trail she had taken from Cedar Flats. He was too far to make out features, but his posture was unnervingly familiar. He wasn't with Townsend's posse. They would be a group, loud and clumsy. This was a predator. A professional. And then she knew. The way he sat his horse, the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting, it could only be one person. Garrett Walsh, the man who had trained alongside her, the man who had stood with her in the final, disastrous moments of the operation in Crimson Canyon, the man who had fired the shot that killed their informant and then blamed it on her, branding her a traitor and a killer. He was the loose end, the living proof of her innocence. And now he was here. This changed everything. Her exile was no longer a simple act of provincial vengeance. It was part of something larger. Walsh wouldn't be here by coincidence. He must be connected to the guns Swift Eagle had tried to warn her about. He was here to ensure the desert finished the job he'd started 5 years ago. He was here to make sure Rajira Castellanos, the last witness to his treason, was silenced for good. A new cold fury washed through her, eclipsing the hot burn of her betrayal by the town. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about him. That night she didn't risk a fire. She huddled in a shallow overhang, the desert floor bleeding the day's heat, the stars a cold, indifferent spray across the black sky. She barely slept, her mind racing, piecing it together. Walsh works with a gunrunner. The gunrunner, this Castellano he mentioned years ago, wants to start a war between the settlers and the Apache. Swift Eagle was scouting the operation. Townsend's mob, blinded by prejudice, becomes the perfect tool, the perfect cover. They lynch the Apache scout, exile the one person who could understand what he was saying, and Walsh gets to watch her die, tying up all the loose ends in one neat, tragic package. It was diabolically simple. The next day, she heard them, the posse. They were louder than Walsh, a clumsy herd crashing through the delicate ecosystem of the desert. Townsend's booming voice carried on the wind, bouncing off the canyon walls. They were hunting her. Not just letting the desert take her, but actively pursuing her. Walsh must have guided them, fed their paranoia, told them she was circling back to help the Apache, to exact some kind of revenge. He was using them as his bloodhounds. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest. Her water was gone, her lips were split and bleeding. The landscape became a maze of red rock formations, towering spires and shadowed canyons that offered both shelter and ambush. She could feel them closing in, their calls echoing, getting nearer. She scrambled up a scree slope, her lungs burning, and found herself cornered in a small, natural amphitheater of rock. There was no way out but the way she'd come in. She could hear their horses in the narrow wash below. It was over. She slumped against the rock, the rough sandstone scraping her back. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a fight for justice, but exhausted and alone, cornered by a mob led by a ghost from her past. She looked at her hands, dusty and bloodless now, and thought of the blood that had started all this, the stain of compassion, her greatest crime. And in that moment of despair, something shifted. The last vestiges of Sarah Mitchell, the timid widow, burned away under the relentless sun. Rajira Castellanos, federal marshal, took her place. She wouldn't die like this. Not as a victim, not as a ghost. If she was going to die, she would die as herself. Her fingers scrabbled at the false bottom of her worn leather satchel, the one thing she had grabbed before leaving the shack. Beneath a layer of dried herbs and spare thread, her fingers touched cold, familiar metal. She pulled it out. The Federal Marshal badge. It was tarnished, its silver finish dulled from years of concealment, but it felt heavy and real in her hand. It was a symbol of a life she had rejected, a past that was nothing but pain. But here, now, it was something else. It was an identity. It was a declaration. With a surge of defiant energy, she got to her feet. She tore a strip of leather from her satchel. From her pocket, she pulled a small, polished piece of tin she used as a mirror. A desperate gamble. An old signal code she hadn't used in years. She climbed to the highest point of the rock amphitheater, ignoring the shouts from below. She could see them now, Townsend and his men, spreading out to ascend the rocks. From a high bluff a half-mile away, she saw him again. Walsh, watching the whole thing unfold through his spyglass. He wanted to be sure. She held the tin high, angling it against the sun, and began to flash a signal. SOSA general distress call. Then, a more specific sequence. Marshal under fire, hostile forces, immediate assistance required. It was a long shot, a prayer sent into the brassy, empty sky. Who would even see it? Who would be close enough to respond? It was madness. But it was her madness. The first shot kicked up dust near her feet. Townsend's men were climbing. "Nowhere to run, Sarah," he bellowed. Rira ignored him. She dropped the tin, its purpose served, and took the tarnished badge. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was from something else. A reclamation. She looked straight across the canyon, straight at the distant figure she knew was Garrett Walsh. She wanted him to see this. With a firm, deliberate motion, she pinned the badge to the rough fabric of her dress, right over her heart. The metal was cool against her skin. It felt like coming home. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer running. She was Rajira Castellanos, and if she was going to make her last stand, the whole damn world would know who she was. The posse was closing in, but her decision was made. This was no longer an exile. It was a rebirth, and as Townsend's men scrambled up the rocks towards her, she prepared not to die, but to fight. The Red Rock Amphitheater became a chessboard, and Rira was its queen, albeit a cornered one. The men from Cedar Flats, fueled by Townsend's rhetoric and Walsh's unseen guidance, moved with a clumsy but determined aggression. They saw a lone woman, an outcast. They didn't see a federal marshal who had spent years mastering the arts of terrain analysis and tactical evasion. Rira moved with fluid economy, using the towering hoodoos and shadowed crevices as her allies. She didn't have a gun, but she had a knife, a sharp mind, and the element of surprise. A man scrambled over a ledge, his face flushed with exertion, and found himself face to face, not with a cowering woman, but with a whirlwind. Rira's move was pure instinct, a disarming technique she hadn't used in years. A sharp strike to the wrist sent his rifle clattering to the rocks. A kick to the knee buckled his leg. He went down with a grunt of pained surprise, out of the fight. She didn't pause. She scooped up a handful of gravel and flung it at another man's face as he peered around a corner, blinding him just long enough for her to slip away into another shadow. She wasn't trying to kill them. She was dismantling their assault, piece by piece. Her actions were precise, disabling, a testament to a code that separated a law woman from a killer. "Spread out! Pin her down!" Townsend roared from below, his frustration echoing in the canyon. "Walsh said she's tricky!" The name, spoken aloud, sent a jolt through Rira. So Walsh wasn't just observing. He was directing them. The thought added a layer of ice to her fury. He was using these ignorant, frightened men as his personal assassins. From his perch he could see her movements, could likely signal her position to Townsend. She was fighting two enemies, the posse in front of her and the ghost directing them from afar. The fight became a brutal ballet. Rira used their numbers against them, luring them into narrow passages where they got in each other's way. She started a small rock slide, nothing lethal, but enough to block one approach and force them to reroute. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body a collection of scrapes and bruises, but her mind was diamond sharp. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but she was in her element. For the first time in 5 years, she felt wholly herself. The fear was gone, replaced by a righteous, defiant fire, but defiance has its limits. They were learning, adapting. They finally managed to pin her behind a large sandstone pillar, shots kicking up plumes of red dust on either side. "Give it up, Sarah!" Townsend yelled. "There's no way out!" She pressed her back against the rock, the sun beating down, the metallic taste of fear returning to her mouth. He was right. Her energy was fading. They had her trapped. She clutched the rifle she'd taken from the first man, checked the chamber. 3 rounds. 3 rounds against a dozen men. Her gaze drifted across the canyon to the bluff where Walsh watched, a silent vulture waiting for the kill. A bitter smile touched her lips. At least she would die with her badge on. And then, a new sound. It wasn't the crack of the posse's rifles or the ricochet of bullets. It was a different report, heavier, more disciplined, a volley of shots from a different direction entirely. A bullet whined past Townsend's ear, smacking into the rock behind him with concussive force. The men of the posse froze, confusion turning to panic. "What in God's name was that?" a man cried out. Rira peered around the edge of her pillar. On the opposite ridge of the canyon wash, silhouetted against the stark blue sky, were riders. 6 of them. They sat their horses with the same ramrod straightness, the same confident authority she had once embodied. They wore dusters, and the sun glinted off the star-shaped badges on their chests. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her signal. Her impossible, desperate prayer had been answered. Leading them, his face a mask of grim determination beneath the brim of his hat, was a man she thought she'd never see again. Marshal Samuel Hayes, her former commanding officer. A steadfast, honorable lawman who had trained her, who had believed in her, and whose face she had last seen etched with shock and disappointment when the evidence, Walsh's fabricated evidence, had been presented against her. "Townsend of Cedar Flats!" Hayes's voice boomed across the canyon, a voice of pure, unassailable authority. "You and your men will lay down your arms. You are interfering with an official operation of the United States Marshal Service." The posse was stunned into submission. They looked from the armed, professional lawmen on the ridge to the lone woman they had been hunting. Townsend stared, his mouth agape, at the badge pinned to Rira's dress, a look of dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. But Rira's attention was fixed elsewhere. On the far bluff, Walsh was no longer observing. He was moving, turning his horse, preparing to flee. No, not this time. "Hayes!" Rira screamed, her voice raw. "It's Walsh! Garrett Walsh! He's the traitor, the gun runner! Don't let him get away!" Hayes's head snapped in the direction she was pointing. He saw the fleeing figure and spurred his horse into action, his men following suit. But Rira was closer. Fueled by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, she broke from cover. She ran, leaping from rock to rock, taking a direct, treacherous path down the scree slope that separated her from him. The posse, forgotten, watched in stunned silence. This was no longer about them. It was a reckoning years in the making. Walsh glanced back, saw her coming, and his face, even from a distance, twisted into a snarl of panicked fury. He raised his rifle, firing a wild shot in her direction. Rira didn't even flinch. She slid the last few feet down the slope, landing in a cloud of dust, and leveled the rifle she held. She had him in her sights. The man who had destroyed her life, stolen her name, and left her for dead. Hayes and his men were thundering down the canyon, but they were too far. It was down to this, her and him, the past and the present, colliding in a cloud of red dust. "It's over, Garrett!" she yelled, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. He laughed, a crazed, desperate sound. "It was over for you 5 years ago, Rira. I should have killed you myself." He wheeled his horse, leveling his pistol for a more carefully aimed shot. In that split second, all the pain, all the years of hiding, all the bitterness coalesced into a single point of cold, clear focus. This wasn't for justice. This was for her. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The single shot echoed like a thunderclap in the canyon. Walsh jerked in the saddle, a blossom of red appearing on his chest. His pistol discharged into the sky as he tumbled from his horse, landing in a heap on the desert floor. Silence. Rira stood there, smoke curling from the rifle's muzzle, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She hadn't realized she was crying. Hayes and his marshals galloped up, surrounding the scene. Hayes dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward her. He looked from Walsh's body to her face, his own expression a storm of conflicting emotions. He saw the badge on her dress, the rifle in her hands, the tear tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "Rira," he said, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken words. Townsend and his men stumbled down from the rocks, their faces pale with shock. They looked at Walsh's body, then at the assembled marshals, and finally at the woman they had cast out, the woman who had just saved them from interfering in a federal matter, a hanging offense. The truth of the situation settled on them with crushing weight. Their righteous anger, their mob justice, had been a lie. They hadn't been hunting a traitor. They had been working for one. Rira finally lowered the rifle. The death of Garrett Walsh didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending, the closing of a chapter filled with pain and ghosts. But as she looked at Hayes, at the body of her betrayer, and at the horrified faces of the men from Cedar Flats, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. The man pulling the strings, Castellano, was still out there. Her personal vendetta was resolved, but the larger threat, the war he was trying to engineer, was just beginning. The aftermath of the firefight was a tableau of tense, unnerving quiet. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Garrett Walsh's body lay in the dust, a stark testament to a long overdue reckoning. Townsend and his men stood in a shamed, disarmed huddle, their blustering certainty evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their error. They looked at Rira not as an outcast, but as something far more unsettling, a law woman they had tried to kill. Marshal Hayes walked over to Walsh's body, kneeling beside it. He conducted a swift, professional search, pulling a folded and waterproofed map from an inner pocket. He spread it on the ground. Rira and the other marshals gathered around. It was a detailed drawing of the region, but marked with unfamiliar symbols and routes. One location was circled in red ink, a place labeled Dead Horse Canyon. Arrows indicated weapon movements pointing from the canyon toward both settler territories and known Apache encampments. "This is it," Hayes said, his voice grim. "This is Castellano's operation. He's not just selling to one side, he's arming both." From the group of marshals, a figure stepped forward. It was Swift Eagle. He had been with them, riding in the rear, a guide rather than a prisoner. His side was bandaged with clean linen, and though he moved stiffly, the fire in his eyes was back. He pointed a finger at the map. "Dead Horse Canyon," he said, his English deliberate and clear. "This is the place of the snake, where the ground is poisoned with his iron." He looked at Rira, then at Hayes. "My people said a white man with a dead soul was making bad medicine there, trading rifles that would sing a song of brother killing brother. I went to see. They shot me." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Castellano wasn't just a gun runner. He was an architect of chaos, a man orchestrating a war for his own twisted purposes. Walsh was his lieutenant, using his federal credentials to move freely and his past with Rira to eliminate any threats. "His ideology is a sickness," Hayes explained, looking at Rira. "We've been tracking him for months. He doesn't believe in profit, not really. He believes the natural state of man is brutal, racial conflict. He wants to prove it. He wants to supply the guns, light the fuse, and watch this whole territory burn to prove his point." A genocidal war, engineered by a nihilist. The thought was chilling. Townsend, overhearing this, finally spoke, his voice hollow. "The raids. The attacks on our homesteads. Likely Castellano's own men, disguised as Apache, to stir up your hatred," Hayes replied, not unkindly. "And then maybe a few retaliatory strikes from younger Apache warriors who'd been provoked. It's a vicious circle, and Castellano holds the chain." The weight of it all settled on them. They were standing on the brink of a bloodbath, and the only people who knew the truth were this small, fractured group, a handful of marshals, a wrongly accused Apache warrior, a disgraced law woman, and a dozen chastened townsmen who had been on the wrong side minutes earlier. "We have to stop him," Rira said. It wasn't a question. "We have to raid that canyon." Hayes nodded slowly. My 6 men against Castellano's entire outfit. In his own fortress. The odds are long, Rira. Then you need more men, she said, her gaze turning to Townsend. A heavy silence fell. The idea was absurd. For the men of Cedar Flats to fight alongside a federal marshal they'd just hunted and an Apache warrior they'd nearly lynched was unthinkable. Townsend looked at his feet, the shame coiling in his gut. It was Swift Eagle who broke the silence. He walked over to Townsend, standing before him not as a supplicant, but as an equal. The man in that canyon wants to see my people die, he said, his voice resonating with quiet power. And he wants to see your people die. Today, in this place, our reasons for fighting are the same. Rira watched the exchange, her heart pounding. This was the crux of it all. Could they bridge the chasm of hatred and fear, even for a moment, to face a common enemy? They're not soldiers, Rira, Hayes argued quietly, gesturing to the posse. They're ranchers and farmers. They know how to shoot, Rira countered. And they know this land. More importantly, she added, her voice dropping, they need this. They need a chance to undo the wrong they did. Don't they, Townsend? She was looking directly at him, her gaze piercing. She wasn't offering forgiveness. She was offering a path to redemption, a path paved with risk and blood. Townsend looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no pity in her expression, only a hard, unflinching challenge. He thought of his son, whose death had started his long, dark journey of hate. He had honored his memory with more hate, but Castellano's evil showed him the lie in that. The true enemy wasn't the Apache. It was the man who profited from that very belief. We'll ride with you, Townsend said, his voice cracking but firm. He turned to his men. We were fools, led by lies and our own fear. We followed a traitor into the desert to hunt an innocent woman. Now we follow a marshal into that canyon to hunt a real devil. Anyone who won't can start walking back to Cedar Flats now. No one moved. Their faces were a mixture of fear, reluctance, and a dawning steely resolve. In the harsh desert light, a fragile, impossible alliance was forged, built on shared shame and a common threat. The ride to Dead Horse Canyon was a silent, tense procession. Marshals, townspeople, and an Apache warrior moved as one body, a strange and volatile organism. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood. They were a nervous army, marching toward a battle that would decide the fate of the entire territory. Rira rode near the front with Hayes and Swift Eagle. The badge was still pinned to her dress. It no longer felt like a ghost from the past, but a promise for the future. The plan was simple and desperate. They would use the cover of dusk to get in close. Swift Eagle would guide them through the treacherous, unmapped approaches. They would hit the camp hard and fast, their only advantage being the element of surprise. Their target was not to win a pitched battle, but to capture Castellano and break the back of his operation. As they neared the canyon, the air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke and whiskey. They dismounted, leaving the horses with a few of the men, and proceeded on foot. The canyon was a jagged wound in the earth, its walls steeped in shadow. Below, in a wide basin, fires burned. Dozens of men milled about, hardened gunslingers and mercenaries, their laughter and rough talk echoing up the rock walls. Crates of rifles and ammunition were stacked high, a dragon's horde of death and destruction. There, Swift Eagle whispered, pointing to a large tent set slightly apart from the others, a lantern burning inside. The dead soul stays there. The raid began not with a bang, but with the silent, coordinated movements of ghosts. Hayes took his marshals to create a diversion on the far side of the camp. Townsend and his men, their faces grim, took up positions along the canyon rim, ready to provide covering fire. Rira and Swift Eagle would go for Castellano. The diversion worked perfectly. A sudden volley of shots from the east sent the camp into chaos. Men grabbed for their guns, shouting and running toward the sound, expecting an attack from a rival gang or a law patrol. In the confusion, Rira and Swift Eagle slipped down into the basin, moving from shadow to shadow, their steps silent. They reached Castellano's tent, the canvas glowing like a paper lantern. Rira held up a hand, listening. Inside, a calm voice was humming a tune. She drew her pistol, shared a look with Swift Eagle, and kicked the flap open. Castellano was sitting at a small, elegant campaign desk, cleaning a silver-inlaid revolver. He was not what Rira had expected. He wasn't a brutish thug. He was handsome, charismatic, with intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed both charming and utterly devoid of warmth. He looked up, his smile not faltering in the slightest, as he saw the pistol aimed at his chest and the Apache warrior at Rira's side. "Well," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I assume Garrett has been detained." "Put the gun down, Castellano," Rira ordered, her voice steady. He chuckled, placing the revolver carefully on the desk. "Of course, no need for unpleasantness." He stood up, his movements unhurried. He wasn't afraid. He was intrigued. "You must be Ruggiero Castellanos. Garrett spoke of you, said you were a true believer. In justice, in order, noble but naive." His eyes flicked to Swift Eagle. "And you have made a friend. How progressive. You see, I'm bringing people together already." The gunfight outside was escalating, a chaotic symphony of shouts and gunfire. Castellano seemed oblivious to it. His focus was entirely on Rira. This was his stage. "Why?" Rira asked, the question she had carried all the way from Cedar Flats. "Why do all this? Why?" He spread his hands, a gesture of magnanimous explanation. "Because this is the truth of the world, Marshal. Look out there." He gestured toward the sounds of the battle. "That is humanity's natural state. Tribe against tribe, color against color. My ancestors understood that. Yours did too. All I'm doing is removing the thin, fragile veneer of civilization and revealing the skull beneath. I'm not a monster. I'm a realist." He was trying to poison her, to plant a seed of his own nihilism in her heart. He wanted her to believe that her fight for justice was a fool's errand, that his vision of the world was the correct one. "You're a coward," Rira said, her voice low with contempt. "You hide in the shadows and hand out guns because you're too afraid to build anything. You can only destroy." Castellano's smile finally tightened. "And what are you building? An alliance between a lynch mob and their intended victim? It's a beautiful fleeting thing, Marshal, but it won't last. Once I am gone, they will go back to hating each other. It is their nature, and yours." He moved with startling speed. Not for the gun on the desk, but for a knife hidden beneath it. He lunged, not at Rira, but at Swift Eagle. Swift Eagle, weakened but warrior-bred, met the charge. They crashed together, a tangle of limbs. Rira couldn't get a clear shot. The tent collapsed around them as they struggled. Outside, the battle raged. Townsend and his men, no longer a mob but a surprisingly effective fighting unit, laid down suppressing fire from the rim, pinning Castellano's men. Hayes and his marshals were methodically working their way through the camp. Rira scrambled through the canvas, emerging into the firelight. Castellano had Swift Eagle on the ground, the knife raised for a killing blow. Rira aimed her pistol, her hand steady. All the pain, all the running, it all came down to this moment. She could kill him. End it. Vengeance for Walsh's betrayal, for the lives he intended to destroy. It would be so easy. But as she looked at him, at his face twisted in a mask of hate, she didn't see a monster to be slain. She saw a criminal to be brought to justice. Killing him would make his argument for him, proving that in the end, violence was the only answer. Wounding him, capturing him, forcing him to face the very system of laws he despised, that was a true victory. She shifted her aim an inch. She fired. The shot was deafening. Castellano screamed, not in death, but in pain and fury. The knife clattered from his nerveless hand as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He staggered back, clutching the wound, his eyes wide with disbelief. Rira walked forward, the pistol still trained on him, her shadow long in the firelight. Her hands were stained again, not with blood of compassion, but with the blood of justice delivered. She had chosen. She would not be him. She would not let him win the argument. The chaotic gunfight began to subside as Castellano's men, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. In the sudden ringing silence, Rira stood over the architect of a war that would never happen, a silent proclamation that justice, not prejudice, would have the final word. The dawn that broke over Dead Horse Canyon was quiet and tense. The air, scrubbed clean by the cool night, carried the lingering scents of gunpowder and blood. The survivors, marshals, townspeople, and one Apache warrior moved with a weary purpose, tending to the wounded, their faces etched with the grim reality of the night's work. The fragile alliance, born of necessity, had been tempered in battle and was now solidifying in the shared task of its aftermath. Castellano, his arm crudely bandaged and his charisma vanished, was bound and under guard, his nihilistic dream shattered. The ride back to Cedar Flats was long and reflective. The sun, which had been a merciless tyrant on Rira's journey out, now felt like a benediction, warming the landscape with a gentle, hopeful light. She rode beside Townsend for a time. They didn't speak of the desert hunt or the night of the posse. They didn't need to. The silence between them was not the awkward void of unforgiven sins, but the quiet understanding of a shared, bloody trial. Townsend looked older, his righteous anger replaced by a profound, sorrowful weight. He had faced the true face of hatred in Castellano, and in doing so, had been forced to see its reflection in his own heart. When they arrived, the town was a different place. Word of the raid, carried by a rider sent ahead, had preceded them. The people who had stood by and watched Rira's exile now lined the single dusty street, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and relief. They watched as the captured mercenaries were led to the town jail. They saw Castellano, the mastermind, a defeated man, and they saw Rira, riding tall, the tarnished marshal's badge still pinned to her dress. She was not the ghost they had cast out. She was their deliverer. Later that day, as the dust settled, Doc Peterson found her sitting on the porch of the small clinic where Hayes and his men were being treated for minor wounds. He held out a cup of coffee. "There's no way to apologize for what we did," he began, his voice heavy with a shame he had earned. "Fear. It makes cowards of good men, or maybe it just reveals the cowards we already were." "Fear is a choice, Doc," Rira said, taking the cup. "Same as courage. We made the wrong one," he admitted. "And you paid the price for it. Townsend is stepping down. The town council, such as it is, they asked me to talk to you. They want you to stay. They want you to be the sheriff." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "We need someone to teach us how to make the right choice." The offer hung in the air. A life, a home, a place not to hide, but to stand. Later, Hayes found her in the same spot, watching the sun set. "I filed my report," he said. "Full exoneration. Your name is cleared, Rira. There's a place for you back in the service. A promotion even. You've more than earned it." She looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse that had almost been her grave. The federal marshals were her past. That life of chasing ghosts across the country, of living out of a saddlebag, it belonged to Rajira Castellanos, the woman who had been betrayed and hunted. She wasn't that person anymore. Hiding as Sarah Mitchell wasn't the answer either. That was a life of fear. "I can't go back, Samuel," she said softly. "My home isn't back there anymore." She turned to him, a small, weary smile on her face. "I think it might be here." She rejected a life in hiding and a career of vengeance, choosing instead to forge something new from the wreckage. She would be the sheriff. She would build a home on the very ground that had rejected her. The final scene unfolded a week later, in the center of town. Rira stood by the well, her tarnished marshal's badge replaced by a new six-pointed star, the silver glinting in the morning sun. It wasn't a symbol of a painful past, but of a future she had claimed for herself. The town was still tense, the peace fragile, but it was a start. She saw him approach. Swift Eagle. His people were camped a few miles from town, in a temporary truce brokered by Hayes before the marshals rode out with their prisoners. He walked into the center of Cedar Flats, and this time, the townspeople didn't reach for their guns. They watched with a nervous, uncertain respect. He stopped before Rira. "My people do not trust your town," he said, his voice even. "And your town does not trust my people. The canyon snake is gone, but his poison remains in the ground." "I know," Rira said. "Trust isn't something you're given, it's something you build." Swift Eagle nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the town, then settling back on her. "The space between my people and yours is wide and deep. It needs a bridge." He paused, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not quite friendship, but a profound, hard-won respect. "You have shown you are not afraid to stand in that space. Perhaps I am not either." He didn't offer his hand. She didn't offer hers. The gesture would have been too simple, too cheap for the chasm they were attempting to cross. Instead, they just stood there, the Apache warrior and the new sheriff, two former enemies finding a common ground in the center of a town that had been reborn through its ordeal. The peace was not absolute. It was a fragile, splintered thing. But it was real. For Rira, no longer a fugitive, no longer a ghost, this was homecoming. A home built not on inherited prejudice, but on earned trust. One scar, one splinter, and one sunrise at a time.